He also chaired the the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's Environmental Law Commission and founded its Academy of Environmental Law. Recently, as executive governor of the International Council of Environmental Law, he is participating in the UN negotiations on strengthening environmental law, such as through proposed measures for a right to a healthy environment and other international instruments, and how they do and can speak for the trees. And so with that, let me turn things over to Professor Robinson. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jimmy, for that kind introduction. And I want to congratulate you and Aaron Daly and all your colleagues on the leadership that you've provided in public education about the rights of nature and how to advance that agenda. The roots of rights and the discussion of rights generally, historically, is very deep in Europe. And it's one of the contributions European jurisprudence has given to the world, or shall I say the experience of an evolution of the recognition of law. It goes back before 1215 and Magna Carta, but we can begin there. Magna Carta recognized that individuals have rights to due process of law, and the English jurist Edward Coke in 1628 enshrined due process in the Petition of Right, which is the basis for the Bill of Rights and most of the constitutional rights in constitutions that were adopted after the late 1700s, 1800s. So we have many constitutional rights that go back to this early attempt to establish rights independent of the government. In the 1800s, Europe gave us the first debate on how to free enslaved people, and the battle against slavery was there. In 1904, the first women's suffrage organization was founded. The Women's Suffrage Alliance was founded in Berlin, and Europe led the battle for the rights to vote for women. So Europe has been a cradle for recognizing rights generally, and it's not surprising that it has a leadership role in environmental rights. The story of the beginning of these rights, we have to reflect on where do rights come from. So legislatures, treaties, negotiation of treaties, constitutions, and social contracts like Magna Carta recognize rights as in distinct groups of individuals or now parts of nature. These rights often are contested. Once they're acknowledged, that doesn't mean everyone agrees with them. So that you have to have a evolution and a continuous reassertion of these rights. The human right to water, which we now have in European jurisprudence and internationally, long was recognized as a utilitarian right when someone polluted your water and you had a right to seek remedies in a court to stop that pollution or to seek compensation for damages. Well, in the early 13th century, King John in England was developing his power in a time in which money was replacing services, feudal services. And to achieve money for his military campaigns to regain his properties and lands in Normandy, he needed money to hire mercenaries and raise his armies. And he would extort money from the people of the countryside by claiming they were illegally on his land in royal forests or taking privileges they didn't have. And they pushed back against this. And so in 1215, there was a revolt against King John, which resulted in the Magna Carta being drafted at Runnymede and sealed there, in which the king agreed to stop his arbitrary extortion of money. And he agreed to allow knights, 12 knights in every county in England, to go forth and collect data on what he had done wrong and report back. King John died in 1216, but the knights came back with their reports, and the regent for the new king, Henry III, issued a Magna Carta again. And then in 1217, they finished the debates to actually issue an entirely new charter. They took the environmental clauses out of Magna Carta and issued the Forest Charter. And in the Article 17 of the Forest Charter is worth reading. The liberties of the forest and the free customs traditionally had, both within and without royal forests, are granted to all in the realm, to everyone. Everyone is also obliged to observe the liberties and customs granted in the Forest Charter. This established the unfettered right of the people in the countryside to collect their firewood, to go into the forest and collect berries, to use the waters of the streams, to graze their cattle and sheep in the landscape in the forest. And whether you were a baron or a commoner, you shared these benefits. So gradually this right was acknowledged, but the kings, every time they wanted money, and subsequent kings also, tried to take away the rights. So the Forest Charter rights were re-promulgated 32 times in the 13th century, 30 times in the 14th century, 8 times in the 15th century, and it was not until 1628 that the rights became firm in English law with the Petition of Right. Commoners' rights still exist, and we have in the Forest of Dean, in the New Forest, in Exmoor Forest, Dartmoor Forest. In many of these former royal forests, the landscape and the habitat, nature is intact because of the Forest Charter and the civilians, the commoners who assert their rights to go into nature. Now, if we take this model of a set of rights within one country that emerged and were preserved for 800 years, they still are contested and fought. We have specialized courts called verdurers in New Forest and in the Forest of Dean that hear the complaints of citizens, of users of the forest, whenever the government is intruding on their access to the forest natural areas. This is a remarkable story. And it's matched, I think, by the development of rights jurisprudence in other fields. For instance, after the horrors of the wars in Europe in the 18th and 19th century, you had the development of humanitarian law, which recognized the rights of civilians and non-belligerents in warfare to have their rights, women and children, innocents. And the International Committee of the Red Cross and the Geneva Conventions are ways to implement and observe humanitarian law. In the 1920s, we had great labor unrest, and rights were given to workers in factories and other settings. And this led to the creation of the International Labor Organization and a series of conventions to protect those who work. The horrors of the Second World War gave rise to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So after, not unlike what happened in England in the early 13th century, after people recognize that they have rights that are being destroyed, they reaffirm those rights and come up with ways to advance them. In the post-colonial area, the developing nations of the world, now sovereign and independent, helped negotiate the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and we're now negotiating how to provide rights to the biodiversity of the oceans. So this process continues, and it really began in a modern sense, as Professor May observed, in the Stockholm Declaration of 1972. I was privileged to attend the Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment, and Article or Principle 1 of the Declaration is something we're still fighting to reaffirm, just as we had over the centuries to reaffirm these other rights. Sweden has been a great leader in developing these rights, and I'm very proud to be on this program with one of the great architects of thinking about these rights, Rebecka. So let me just quote Principle 1 in my closing. Man has the fundamental right to freedom, equality, and adequate conditions of life in an environment of equality that permits a life of dignity and well-being, and he bears a solemn responsibility to protect and improve the environment for present and future generations. Well, embedded in this early articulation of a right is also the autonomous right of nature, the autonomous right of unborn humans and unborn flora and fauna that have yet to be part of our community of life. So we're in debt to Europe for this history of developing rights and giving us the platform to articulate, understand, and fight for them. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the dialogue that we're going to have in this call, this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Robinson. That was just wonderful as usual, and we're inspired by how you've taken to heart the Stockholm Declaration's admonishment to protect and enhance the environment. Thank you for taking that to heart as well. So next we have Rebecka Le Moine, who's trying to take this to heart at the domestic level in Sweden. She's a member of the Green Party and a spokesperson for biodiversity. Rebecka has been awarded the Environmental Hero Award by the World Wildlife Foundation and the King of Sweden for taking the initiative to celebrate the UN Biodiversity Day in Sweden. And with a master's degree in conservation biology and a background as a biology consultant, her biggest concern is to find political solutions, as you'll hear about, to tackle the mass extinction of species, including constitutional amendments to protect rights of nature. Therefore, she's working to change our basic values where animals and nature also have legal rights. Won't you join me in welcoming Rebecka? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you also for the nice presentation, Nick. And yes, I'm going to start to present myself also as a biologist because that's my background and my education. And while I was studying biology, I studied math, chemistry, taxonomy, evolution, and ecology. But I studied this as it was separated from the rest of the world and the society and economy and politics. So we never even integrated these different fields. And it was quite frustrating to learn how to measure and observe life on Earth, how to understand this, but to see it, how it decreases and how it is being abused and how it actually disappears by our actions. And I thought that our role as a biologist should not only be to observe what is being made. I think that we have to integrate this knowledge about life into society and economy and build up our society on this from the planetary boundaries and instead of compromising the food and the life web. So, and as I was studying, it sometimes came up to discussion, is biology and conservation biology considered a nature science program, or is it considered a program of philosophy and social science? And I think it must be both. So of course we can measure everything down to atoms, and we can actually by taking temperatures we can show a climate crisis that is ongoing. But the real question and the interesting question is also to integrate this with what is life and what is it to us? Why does it matter for us? And is nature only a resource, or is it alive itself? And what relationship should we have towards nature? How do we as human beings deal with these questions across time and space and cultures? And I'm sure that this has a lot to do with the crimes that we are being now conducting to Earth itself. Because if we see it as an object, the Earth has no right, and it feels maybe reasonable for us to take as many and as much resources that is available for our own sake. But if we consider Earth as something living, with its own interest to live on and exist and flourish and regenerates, it's a totally different story. And when I was studying, I also asked a lot of questions about what right the one species has to cut through the food and web of life. And when I was finished with my studies, I worked as an ecology consultant with environmental assessments in the field, doing reports, and I realized that all these cases I was working with was built upon a worldview where human beings is kind of dominating the rest of the life on Earth. And my job was to lesser the harm every time, to try to find paths that didn't harm nature more than necessary. But always we had the right to hurt nature. So when I came into contact with the movement in Sweden working with rights of nature, it felt like everything was falling into places. And as a politician, I believe that we have to do much more than the politicians are doing, but we won't succeed unless we change this problematic world view. So that is what has to change. And I also honestly think that this time Anthropocene is making people both frustrated and depressed. And we are longing for something better than this. We are longing to make peace with nature and to give something back. And therefore, I think this movement is very positive, because we are longing to extend our moral and our legal rights to include nature in it. And I was also asked to give some kind of update from Sweden, because this idea, since 2017, this movement has already accomplished a lot, and the movement is growing for every day. So in 2017, Earth Rights Conference was held in Sweden in Sigtuna, and that was a great milestone for the movement, and participants were gathering from all over the world, and there we recognized the need of an Earth-centered worldview, and the need of them to implement this worldview in our legal systems, and to give indigenous peoples knowledge and rights to territories. And since then, also the Sami parliament in Sweden have endorsed the Universal Declaration of Rights of Mother Earth, because Sami, like many other indigenous people, have the traditional ways of life threatened between climate change and industries like mining and forestry. And we also have a book release about the rights of nature in 2019. And this has been sold out. It's very, very popular, and it's spreading the word about the rights of nature. And also one other conference has been held with a tribunal about Lake Vättern. And during this, the judges came into the conclusion that the current and proposed treatment of the lake is a violation against the rights of Mother Earth. And together with the network of rights of nature in Sweden, I have been hosting a seminar about rights of nature with leading experts in the world, including Marie Margil, who was visiting us. And from that seminar, I also had enough to put a motion in the parliament amending of the rights of nature in the constitution, in the constitutional law in Sweden. And it has not yet been discussed because of Corona. Everything has been delayed. And also the Swedish church includes rights of nature in its educational program. And also Färnebo, which is an educational center, is now holding courses about rights of nature, sharing and spreading this knowledge around. So this is some updates that just has been happening from the 3 past years now. And this idea is really growing and inspiring people in a really, really fast way. And I look forward now to take the debate in the parliament. And I think many people are not really realizing how big this is in the political debate. But I think as soon as we get there, it's going to spread to other parties as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was fantastic. And we hope to hear more about what you expect in the Swedish Parliament. So now it's just a time for some conversation, some dialogue. And I'll just take the chair's prerogative and ask a few questions and get your thoughts, Rebecca and Nick, on these as well. So the first one is whether public perceptions of rights evolve over time, like the rights of everyone to forests and the Forest Charter that Professor Robinson mentioned, and what's the impact of that on rights-based approaches, either to afford a healthy environment or to recognize rights of nature. Nick, would you like to go first on this one, please?
Well, thank you, Jimmy. When I was a law student, Rebecca's story of her biology studies reminded me, there was no environmental law. And I went to university and I said, what's wrong with this picture? The law is all about exploiting nature and managing private rights to own nature, but where does nature have any rights? So I was part of that generation that tried to build environmental law and is still doing so. And what that tells me, in a way, her experience and mine in different generations, is that the rights are there. The rights are implicit or intrinsic in the natural systems of the planet. This has been recognized for a long time in indigenous peoples' communities, where the relationship of people and plants and animals and systems like the flow of the water in a river is all a correlative set of embedded relationships. We're all sharing the same life and systems of life. But we take it for granted when everything's going well. It's when something disrupts that people have to then find a rights-based approach to pushing back against the disruption. And so while rights may be self-evident, they're only self-evident when they become evident. And we have to have a way of recognizing them. In ecosystems, there are those now who promote ecosystem integrity as an intrinsic interpretation of harmony with nature. But those who are defending Pachamama around the world and putting rights of nature into the constitutions, as in Ecuador and some other countries, Bolivia, this is a way to clarify what the rights are that we deem to be intrinsic or have evolved inside of our living systems. That's one of the stories or one of the consequences of the Forest Charter. If we don't make explicit the things that are implicit, then many people discount them. They think they don't exist. They don't want to pay attention to them. One has to sort of write them down and put them into a law for people to observe them. In oral traditions of indigenous communities, that's all done orally. Every generation teaches its next generation and reminds itself in its hymns of praise and thanks to the natural world that these rights are real. But those of us that live by the written word have to write it down.
Rebecca, what are your thoughts about that, the notion that those who have to live by the written word have to write it down?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I think also like the rights can evolve over time, and it has to do with, I mean, how desperate we are, maybe. As a human being, maybe we are most selfish if we are in a like if we are in a desperate situation, we think about ourselves. But if we can have some kind of I mean, if we have support and if we have money and if we have democracy and if we have rights, we can kind of extend our moral and and by our moral we can also include people in the whole world, not maybe our own kind, but in international solidarity. And next step in that moral could be to include nature and the future generation, and further away is the whole ecosystem and the planet itself. And I think where we are now with human rights is that we have included the people, humans who are kind of living now and that we can face. And the next step is to include the future generation. But we have to make sure that that is also included in the legal system. And we have to fight for this, to push forward and give rights in order to include everyone, every living being, not only human lives, but also other lives. So, I mean, we are not in human being has developed over time. So now we have all this wisdom, we have all this knowledge, and we have so much power in our hands. So what we should do is try to expand the moral, and by that, next step is to include this in our laws.
So Rebecca, that's so interesting. What your remarks invoke is what to do with rights as rights change over time in a democracy. Also apropos of Professor Robinson's remarks about that, about how we treat rights differently when things are going well. But the real test of a right is when things aren't maybe going so well. And Rebecca, you mentioned about this idea of recognizing the rights of future generations and the rights of nature in a new discourse about constitutional protection and rights. And so here's my question for you. And Nick, I'm curious to hear your responses to this as well. But what does recognizing those sorts of rights, including a right to a healthy environment, including rights of nature, and so-called intergenerational equity mean in a democracy?
Yeah, well, when I was starting to get interested in politics, I said in my personal campaign that I wanted to be a spokesperson for the lynx and the threatened species that we have in Sweden, because I was really frustrated that they didn't get any space in the debate, and that's why I signed up on to politics. And when I came into the parliament, I was the third. We decided I would be the spokesperson for biodiversity. So I always try to take the threatened species and the ecosystems perspective in my debates and in my work. But as long as we don't have the legal rights there, it's gonna be a few people realizing how important this is in the political world. So, I mean, if we include rights of nature in our constitutional law, every politician have to consider it, because it's quite rare to speak about biodiversity still in Sweden in the parliament. So, if we have it already in the laws, every politician and every person in Sweden have to include it somehow. So I think that the voices for nature and biodiversity will be leveled up by a lot, and it will, I think, in the long term, we will actually extend the democracy to include nature as well.
So in that regard, Rebecca, what I'm hearing is that you regard recognizing rights of nature as reinforcing democracy, if not democratic ideals. And Nick, what are your thoughts about that question?
Well, I think it's a very provocative question, because if you look at the failure to protect the great forest of the Amazon, the legal Amazon today, or the repealing of the environmental laws in the United States by the Trump administration and Congress, you have a perversion of the kind of democracy that Rebecca envisions, in which the biodiversity has a seat at the table and people will respect biodiversity. I think it takes generations to achieve that, and we have to fight back against the populist anthropocentric approach that nature is there to be exploited and to serve us, rather than the ecocentric approach that we are a part of the community of life. And there are endless philosophers and religious leaders, Thomas Berry and Aldo Leopold and others, who have come to the conclusion about our role as just a member of the community of life who must uphold it. So the democracy of all of life having an equal relationship depends upon our acknowledging our correlative rights with nature. When I was a young lawyer, I went into federal court in New York to represent a swamp, a marsh. I began my career representing wetlands and fighting for the wetlands in New York and writing the legislation for that. I also am a great admirer of our Constitution in New York, which since 1894 has provided for the constitutional protection of the Adirondack and Catskill forests and the Forest Preserve in New York. And every year since 1894, when timber barons and corruption was burning all the forests and chopping them down and causing vast flooding and erosion, like any good developing country, we stood up and said, no, we're going to put this into the Constitution and throw the exploiters out and let the Forest Preserve be forever wild. Those are the words in the Constitution. The Forest Preserve shall be kept forever wild, and no one can cut a tree. Nature must be sovereign. And when we make room for nature, we come to appreciate it and live with it. So every year since 1894, we've actually added more land to the Forest Preserve, and people have taxed themselves to create and buy land and put it aside. And we've created a mechanism by which biodiversity can be supported popularly. So it's not enough just to say we have a right in the Constitution. As we learned with the Forest Charter, you have to fight for that right in every generation and even into the present and future.
So let's talk about that as a jumping off point about fighting for the rights for present and future generations. And Rebecka, I'll begin with you here and put you on the spot. I hope you'll forgive me. And then Nick, put you on the spot in a more general way. But Rebecka, what do you think, when you think about the prospects for constitutional recognition of rights of nature in Sweden, how do you think that discussion will go? And Nick, more generally in Europe in particular, but perhaps elsewhere, do you see rights of nature following the same emerging path as rights to a healthy environment have enjoyed in the last 4 decades, or something else? Thanks.
All right, so the process of actually getting there and to implement and to have a vote for the rights of nature in our constitutional law, it will take a lot of time and energy. And I think what I am trying to do is to start the debate and to start making people think in another kind of perspective about this, because it will take 2 governments in a row to say yes before the constitutional law is actually changed. And right now, there is no party, not even the Green Party, that has decided on a Congress that they are in favor of rights of nature. Of course, I will try to make that happen with the Green Party next Congress, but so there will be a long way. So the Social Democrats has to go the same way, and then we don't know who is going to be in the government, but the government itself has to vote for it 2 times in a row. So it will take at least 8 years, and that before we get there has to be kind of a consensus about this in the politics. But I think this is a really strange way of people in Sweden or the politicians in Sweden to think. But if we try to show what it would mean for a specific ecosystem, like the Lake Vättern, if we use that as a pilot project and try to implement and to see how Lake Vättern would be treated and what would happen if Lake Vättern actually had legal rights, I think that would be the way to go. And then maybe we can extend this, and maybe we can work with the Swedish church and landowners. So maybe they can have contract with their land and voluntarily give the rights. I mean, not voluntarily, but they will have like from the ground, the grassroots. I think we will use the people movement in this case in Sweden long before the big parties think this is a great idea. So it's going to be a long process.
Okay. Nick, your thoughts, please.
Well, I'm glad that Rebecca has started, with her colleagues and friends, has started this campaign. I think Europe is uneven across Europe as to the recognition of these rights. For instance, in much of Russia, you have the best protected wild nature in the world in the Zapoviedniki. Vast areas of nature set aside from the time of the czars through this Soviet Union and now today for nature and for scientists to study and understand nature. The Zapoviedniki are sacred in Russian popular thinking. But Russia is still exploiting the rest of wild nature and not so wild, and causing greenhouse gas emissions and big problems. So it's uneven even within one country. The floods and the droughts and the wildfires that are being experienced all around the world are like nature pushing back against our unbridled exploitation of nature. And we have to respond. Now in France, you remember they had very severe heat waves and killed many people in Paris and other cities. France has been re-examining what are our people's relationships with nature. And they held for 1 year a citizens' climate convention in which citizens all around the country met to debate how can we remake government to better protect nature and people. And they insisted it wasn't just climate change, it was all of nature. Climate change is just one aspect of the relationship. And they presented their findings to President Macron, and he accepted them. Now they have to fight to get them implemented, but there's been a huge movement of change. Even in France, the Environment Ministry doesn't have that name anymore. It's called the Ministry of Ecological Transformation. So we have to basically move beyond our protection to a stewardship and a co-stewardship, a shared relationship. This is going to take a very long time. And that's why I told the story about how the rights of the forest took 800 years to get well recognized. And we still have to fight for them all the time. So it's an engagement. And I think we have to understand that our relationship with nature means that procedural rights are as important as substantive rights. Everyone thinks if we say nature has a right, something will happen. But the access to justice, the ability to have a procedural premise for that, to go into a court and represent a wetland or a swamp, that's very important. And that's really the next stage, because without that, future generations are not present with us today. We have to really make the early proposals for ombudsmen for future generations into a reality and give them a seat at the table today as we destroy their futures.
Yes, speaking of giving future generations a seat at the table and people who aren't necessarily at the table now, we have wonderful questions from the audience that I'd like to turn to now. And just, I feel like I want to, first of all, reassure Nick and Rebecca that we're right on time. This is going very well, thank you. So questions from the audience, and I'm just going to telescope these a little bit. The first one will be more narrow, and then they'll get increasingly broader. Just curious to hear your thoughts about these. And Rebecca, we'll begin with you again, if that's okay. But the first one is, and I'll just read it. Thinking in the legal world, how detailed do you consider that rights of nature have to be developed in national laws? For example, having a core content as human rights, which states are obliged to fulfill, or should recognition be flexible and allow the judiciary to develop and give content to rights of nature? Rebecca, thank you. I think you're on mute, Rebecca.
Oh, sorry about that. Well, I think this has to develop together as we go. But when I was putting the motion in the parliament, which is not really, I mean, we haven't in the parliament yet debated it, so I don't know how it will be taken and how people will kind of treat it. But what we did was that we, together with Marie Margil, I developed a motion to give rights to naturally exist and to flourish and to regenerate and develop, and to have rights to restoration, recovery, and conservation, and to make its own to have its own natural functions. So those were the kind of words that we were using. But yeah, I don't know exact. Sorry if I didn't really understand the question, but that was it about the wordings. Then that was the words we used.
Right, about how specific laws should be, or should we leave it to courts to figure out the details and implement them along the way? Nick, do you have any thoughts? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think we have to be kind of general and to then see how it goes and how it is being implemented. So that's the the answer that I have.
Okay. Nick, any thoughts about that?
Well, we humans evolved in the natural world. Our biological functions are very similar to the biological functions of another animal. We're very close to certain animals, not just the primates, but pigs and other animals in our basic functioning. And our doctors now share parts of pigs in operations with humans, so you can even exchange your evolutionary life-giving organs between species. And we're now in a pandemic. And where did the pandemic come from? It came from destroying the habitat for wild viruses to live in other species symbiotically in ways that did not spill over to humans. So in zoonotic diseases, we have destroyed the habitat for the wild animals in the forests, and they spill over and infect us. And now we have, through the problem of zoonosis, which is not a problem if everyone is wild and healthy, we have unhealth and this great pandemic. So this should teach us that we need to do a much better job protecting the forests and the wild habitats of the world, and keep the viruses happy in the wild and not coming to find a new host in another animal like us. So there's a great back and forth between us and other species that we do not recognize in law. Very few laws are strong in protecting wild areas. I think what Sweden and some Scandinavian countries do in having these contracts in which farmers would have a contract to basically protect some nature on their land. This is a good way of making clear and articulate the natural systems that are around us. And law has to evolve in this direction. But I agree with Rebecka, it's an evolutionary process that we're learning how to do. We're social animals, and we have to learn our socialization. We put together, for instance, the Sustainable Development Goals in the General Assembly. And by 2030, we're to have attained the goals, not just because of the pandemic, but because of business as usual. We're still resisting implementing most of those reforms. SDG 16 included the rule of law and the environmental rule of law as a foundation for a peaceful society. But in all nations, there is very little being done to implement that. Look at the massive use of chemicals today. In every nation, whether it's in Europe or developing countries, the chemicals are used, abused, and they are killing the web of life. And it's time for us to roll back our generous laws that allow widespread use of chemical substances that are synthetic and organic chemicals that never existed in nature. We should use them carefully. And now we're moving into synthetic biology and planning to change the biological character of other species, perhaps without doing the kind of deep environmental impact assessment of that is needed. So I think we are not necessarily doing better or worse in any part of the planet. We are doing worse in all parts of the planet. Europe is just like the rest of the world. And we have to begin this dialogue to establish a clearer understanding of our rights and duties.
Okay, fantastic. And in understanding or having a clear understanding of those rights and duties, let me combine three questions. And thank you, by the way, audience, for sending these just fantastic questions. And in the Q&A box, I think we're also going to try to answer some in that box as well, the ones we don't get to over the next 10 minutes. But for now, this next question just goes to sort of the nature of rights, no pun intended. And that is, who has the right or standing, if you will, to defend a right to a healthy environment and to defend rights of nature? And as follow-up to that, and again, compressing several questions, are rights natural, or are they bestowed by the government? And should ecocentrism serve as a substitute for anthropocentrism to address these conflicts? Nick, why don't we begin with you, if you have any thoughts about any aspect of that, and then we'll turn to Rebecka. Thank you.
Well, I think these are very important questions, and we live in an anthropocentric era, and we have ever since maybe the agricultural revolution. So it's not going to be so easy to move to an ecocentric view. The indigenous peoples around the world never lost their ecocentric view. It was embedded in their community of life. But we divorced ourselves from it, and we need to refine it. And there are guides for that. But it's going to take much education and much experience. And I think the tragedy is that we will experience the need to reestablish our relationship as we retreat from the coast. Sea level rise and the melting of the glaciers is going to force us to resettle much of humanity further away from the coastline. Now, we can either do that with a respect for nature in a gracious and respectful way to restore resilience in ecosystems, or we can do it in a blunt, hard way by putting down cement and trying to tame nature to do what we want. So the choice is ours. If we write into our constitutions duties and rights that we do this in a naturally sensitive way, we can make the transition to help nature and restore our community of life. But it's not at all clear to me that we'll succeed in doing so, and we certainly won't do so uniformly in every country. Some will do it better than others. That's the experience so far that the humans present to each other.
Rebecka, your thoughts?
Well, yeah, I think also we have to shift from the anthropocenic to the ecocentric way of thinking. And I think who is gonna represent the nature and be the spokesperson in the legal in the legal sense. And I think that we are a creative kind of species, that if we just use our fantasies and if we can read up on how ecosystems work and how different species work and what is the threats and what is the demands that they have, I think it will be, I think it will go fine. And if we think about it, I think companies sometimes is really abstract for me. Who is Google? Who is Facebook? I have no idea, but they have legal rights and they have someone who can present them in courts. But ecosystems, the forest where I'm living, doesn't have a voice, and it's really concrete for me. And I can, just by walking in the forest, I believe I have some kind of sense of that this forest wants to continue to live. And it doesn't take so much. I mean, you don't have to be a biologist, but I mean, so I think our imagination can really save us from our imagination will make this possible to be a voice for nature also in the legal processes.
Yes, terrific. Yeah, can our imaginations save us from ourselves? Which brings me to the next question. And we may be getting to the end here, but this is a broader question, telescoping out. And I'll just read it to you. It's with the heightened concern, especially regarding wildfires, and only 10 years left to achieve the UN SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. What do you think is the most reasonable path towards sustainability given competing urgencies? Adopting new resolutions to protect the climate, or work to structure new enforcement mechanisms of existing goals, or laws to protect rights of nature, or laws to protect a right to a healthy environment? All of the above, none of the above. A simple question, right? So Nick, why don't we begin with you? Thank you.
Well, I don't think we really have an answer for that. I think it's part of the human experience to meet these challenges in every generation and then find a pathway forward. I've been advocating, along with others, recognizing resilience as a legal principle, not just a phenomenon that exists in ecosystems or in human health, but resilience can be emulated, it can be advanced, or it can be weakened and destroyed. So if we take our human creativity and rally around making our species more resilient and all the ecosystems we live in more resilient, then we have a better chance of moving forward. Now, we do these things as humans through laws and through, that's how we acculturate things. We write them down into laws and then we try to enforce them or achieve universal respect for them through education and so on, through economic incentives or disincentives. So we need to consensus around the written version of what is our right of nature. What is the right of nature? We don't know until we do that, that we're all speaking with one voice in one direction. It won't happen in every place all at once, but it can begin to happen. And there are many examples in the history of rights where it has happened. So this gives me great hope that we will do it with our back against the wall and with great losses as we have now in the pandemic, but we will learn to do it because frankly, we are part of the community of life and we want to unite that community again. We've broken it.
Okay, and in that context of hope amongst despair, Rebecka, do you share Professor Robinson's optimism that with our backs against the wall, we can develop rights-based means to save the planet and to save nature and save ourselves? Another easy question.
Yeah. Well, I think that what is it all about, these SDG goals and the Paris agreements? It's also kind of a goal set for us because the planet will be hurt, the biodiversity will be lost and to a great extent. The climate will be rapidly changing already. So all of these things we cannot, we can't really save the planet from this because it has already happened and we're in the middle of it. But so everything, in my point of view, is about how we treat it from this moment and on. And I think maybe all of the above, I really don't remember all of them, but I mean, what I'm trying to say is it's so urgent. This situation is so many crises together, and we have to do everything we can. And I think that just setting up goals on the side of our lives and on the side of what we are usually doing in companies and how what we are doing with our 40 hours work week, we will never reach them until we really implement them in everything we do. And that has to do with the economy. And I believe in the Kate Raworth's model about the donut model. and that is that the economy and the society can only flourish in a good way if we actually consider the planetary boundaries and the social boundaries that we have. And within that space, we can have a good society. But it won't happen just by chance. We have to put rules and we have to have laws that are forcing us to go within this. Because right now, this economic system, the capitalistic system that is not being, which is just destroying the earth in a really creative way, it would take so much life down the road. So I don't know if that's really optimistic, but I think it's really important that we do everything we can. And I think this rights of nature is so important, but it will take a lot of time. So therefore we have to do what we can, what we are believing in, what we have, what we are engaging in, what we have energy for, because it's really a race against time.
So speaking of a race against time, Rebecka, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nick. We're out of time. So next we turn to North America with Chuck O'Neill and Linda Sheehan, a panel that will begin in 15 minutes, moderated by Tom Lindsay. But that was just a fantastic conversation about rights of nature in context, going back in time, moving forward in time, and diverting our energy in ways that can save ourselves from ourselves, as someone put it earlier. So thank you so much. I hope everyone will virtually join me in thanking Nick and Rebecka. See you soon.